who are interested in linking their passion for community service and action with academic study and research in their fields of interest. His work includes helping Stanford students develop their potential for public scholarship and social action in the local, national, and global levels. Before arriving at Stanford, Clayton held a dual appointment as assistant professor of anthropology and director of the Center for Service Learning at the College of Coastal Georgia. Previous to that, he served as an assistant professor of education and director of the Service Learning director of the Office of Service Learning at Colorado State. Finally, is Tamika Bennett, who's the executive director of Youth United for Community Action. She's a well-known activist figure here in Palo Alto. Experienced organizer and lifelong East Palo Alto resident as a youth, and in fact she's sort of a model for all that we aspire to do. She was involved in the East Palo Alto Youth Commission. During her senior year in high school, she was a youth leader with Peninsula Interfaith Action. She joined the YUCA family in 2011. She formally coordinated all leadership development activities and still serves as the main campaign organizer with their environmental justice and affordable housing campaign. She formerly sat on the East Palo Alto Planning Commission. She's a graduate of the 2015 Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, hosted by Urban Habitat. She also sits on a host of commissions and boards geared toward making a difference in the areas of climate change, social and environmental justice, affordable housing, youth leadership development, and racial justice. She's also the co-founder of a nonprofit called Rebooting History, a documentary effort to record East Palo Alto history and lift up the stories of those fortunate enough to experience what was once known as Ravenswood High School. So please join me in welcoming all three speakers, and we'll hear from them. So down this way, is that okay? Tony?
So touch on each of the three questions.
Or whatever catches your attention.
Okay. Thank you, David and everyone, for inviting me. As David mentioned before, I started this work as a kind of, I guess an advocate is the word. I did research that included housing and certainly displacement of populations, but I didn't really have any particular expertise in housing policy. One of the really interesting things to me, now having worked in this for a year and a half, is how in a lot of ways housing is seen as a kind of niche area of policy, whereas to me housing is one of the most fundamental and basic of all human rights and needs. And so to sometimes show up at city council meetings and be treated as a representative of this kind of small niche policy field, after over a decade of doing research around the world on displacement and forced evictions was kind of jarring. So one of the many pieces of this work I try to move is to convince, I guess, people who aren't already convinced that housing is in fact a fundamental political, social, and civil rights issue of our time, especially now in the United States as we're experiencing this kind of wave of hot property markets around the country that's leading to a new era of displacement of low-income people and people of color. That said, a lot of the day-to-day work is kind of like these nitty-gritty policy fights and so on. And I just got an email on the BART. I came from Oakland today. And I got an email on the way. Someone I work with, in this email forwarded from this guy, and just to give you a sense of what's happening out there. So this person sent an email to my friend who said, I know someone who's a babysitter for my kids who lives in Fremont. Her landlord has threatened to raise her rent twice over the last 6 months. I believe the first increase was from $1,600 to $1,750 back in April. Now she received notice that he will raise her rent to $2,300 starting January 1st. From this limited information, can you tell me if this is legal? So we get stuff like this all the time. And those are just the people who actually try to reach out to someone and who have the ability to reach out, whether they know somebody or this is someone's babysitter. It's not the person themselves reaching out, but presumably someone of relative affluence who employs a babysitter who's now threatened with potentially losing this babysitter. So this is a little window into what's happening. To jump now to the bigger question of housing justice, just so you know, I'm not checking text messages. I put my notes on my phone.
Very
That's right. So as David also mentioned, I've since 2007 been working with the Right to the City Alliance, which is a national organization of about 40 predominantly grassroots, community-based organizations representing low-income people of color, and made up of low-income people of color, led by people of color, often by women of color, that began as a national initiative to fight gentrification, which they were all fighting locally, but realized that this was a fight that was extra local, and that a lot of the sources of their problems were extra local, whether it's big real estate developers, whether it's policy at the federal, I mean, a number of things that necessitated a coming together of people working on this locally to fight regionally, statewide, and nationally. And over the last 8 years that we've been doing this work, we've really refined our analysis around housing. And last year, Right to the City put together a report which I helped to put out called Rise of the Renter Nation. And the basic argument of that report was that, one, the housing crisis was not over, because as the market began to rebound, here we kind of conflate markets with people. So if the market's doing well, then people must be doing well. In fact, that was not the case, especially for the populations that Right to the City is and represents. Secondly, that the housing crisis is actually a renter crisis. That when you talk about low-income people, people of color, that these are predominantly renter populations, and all of the projections from the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies to the HUD, whoever we want to talk to, is projecting that the number of renters and the proportion of renters is going to grow for at least the next 20 years. That more and more people are going to be pushed out of ownership into rental, but more importantly, fewer people are ever going to become homeowners. So to talk about the housing crisis as a crisis of ownership was to completely miss 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the picture, depending on where you talk about. So we knew this intuitively, we knew it through our work, we knew it through stuff we were putting out in reports and so on, but we really wanted to make a bold statement on the national level saying the housing crisis is a renter's crisis. So the report is our attempt to do that. Part of what we do then, because it's a policy report, is we try to offer policy solutions and policy framings. And so we offer this framework of housing security / housing justice. At the time, over a year ago when we put it out, we were using housing security. I've started to gravitate more towards housing justice. I don't know why, I just have. And the report offers 5 pillars of housing justice. So our argument is that if you really want to provide a framework, policy and otherwise, a framing framework for real housing justice, here are the 5 things you need to look at. Number 1 is affordability, and this is not in order of importance. 1 is affordability, which really, now having done this work for a year and a half, I can tell you is all anyone really ever talks about, for the most part, at least within the context of housing policy. I mean, of course, there's code enforcement and stuff, but that's actually not seen as like a political fight. But so affordability. And within that, there's actually a huge battle to be fought, because the 30% of income measure that's usually used, right, if you're paying less than 30%, you're fine. That's actually not true for low-income people. For many, if not most low-income people, 30% of their income on housing is way too much. That fight alone is a huge fight, right? Even advocates, even myself on the day-to-day level, you can't get out of using that. Like, we got to get below 30. And that's only 1 of 5 pillars, right? The other pillars are accessibility, meaning that there are lots of populations that even if they have the money, have a hard time accessing housing. So of course we can talk about racial discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders, discrimination against people returning from prison, discrimination of single women with kids, right? So there's a whole number of accessibility issues that are not just linked to affordability. Stability, this is the displacement piece. It doesn't matter if you can afford housing if next month your landlord's going to raise it so that you can't afford it. Right? So there need to be policies in place, and there needs to be a deep political understanding that part of what we mean by housing justice is that long-term stability for people. And that keeps households stable, it keeps neighborhoods and communities stable, and those things are really important. Quality and health. It doesn't matter if your housing is affordable and you can get into it if it's full of mold, if there's lead paint, if it's near toxic land, all things which of course impact predominantly low-income people of color. So the quality of the housing is important, and the quality of the neighborhood, access to green space. To us, those are not like, well, it's nice if you can get those. Like, yeah, affordability really matters, and if there's a park nearby, bonus. No, no, no. Housing justice means people have access to decent living environments when they step outside the door as well. Sorry, it keeps like that. And finally, community control. I think I did all, yeah. And this is, in some ways, the biggest fight, because now we're talking about the decommodification of land and housing, right? And for Right to the City, in a sense, that's what distinguishes us politically from most other advocates that do work around housing rights, housing justice, is that as long as housing is distributed by the market as a commodity, we will never get housing justice. So that means things which are relatively uncontroversial, like community land trusts, limited equity ownership, right? There are a number of things that are out there that don't set off like alarm bells like you're a communist, right? But fundamentally, we make the argument that the commodification of land, private property, the real estatification of urban land, that is really the root problem. Because if you look at now, like Airbnb spends $8 million to defeat one measure in San Francisco.
And they did
right?
it.
And they defeated it. But they also galvanized the opposition, so we'll be back next year. But they saw that the $8 million was a drop in the bucket given how much they could make as long as land remains a commodity. Right? So we have to also move policies that are about the decommodification of land, of taking housing out of the market. Right? And this is a much easier argument to understand, even though we're fighting here too when you talk about things like water. Right? So when you hear Nestle or others talk about water's not a right, people really lose it. Like, what are you talking about? To me, housing is no different. Not that housing and water are interchangeable, right? But in terms of building a dignified, just society, you cannot separate housing out as a commodity and water as something which everyone has a right to. Not if you believe in, a moral kind of building blocks of society. Not if you believe in housing justice. So that's the housing justice piece. In terms of the fights, I'm just going to go brief here because I don't want to. We can come back to this. The rights versus commodity piece is big. Is housing a right or is housing a commodity? That I think is a big political battle we need to fight. It's being fought everywhere, all across the world. Right? When landless people in Brazil take over land, they're saying land is a right, not a commodity. When people in New York, homeless people squat in empty buildings, they're saying this building needs to be occupied because we have 50,000 empty units and 10,000 homeless people, so why is anyone sleeping on the street? Right? So there are movements around this, but of course at the kind of meta level, if you look at the Democratic presidential debates, they never talked about housing. Right? Certainly didn't talk about decommodification of land. So there's a lot of kind of propaganda work to get people thinking and talking about this, right? And I think we're at a time where there's actually opportunity to do that. More kind of pragmatically, this is the Airbnb case, but most of the fights we fight in the jurisdictions that I work in around the Bay Area, we're up against real estate. We're up against landlords, landlord associations, apartment owner associations, and realtors. And they have a stranglehold on local politics. And that is, in many ways, I think, in all the jurisdictions I work in or I'm aware of, as far as movements get, eventually that's the wall they hit. Whether there's elected officials in front of them, kind of, or whether you actually hit that wall. So in Richmond, which passed rent control 4-1 in July, California Apartment Association immediately went in and was paying $12 to $20 per signature to get people. So signature gatherers were flooding into Richmond because it's a rough economy. It's kind of like, it's the Uber Airbnb model of politics, like pay for signatures. People are unemployed, underemployed. Hey, here's $12.50 a signature. Right, so they got double the number they needed to put it on the ballot. So now the ordinance for rent control and just cause has to go to the ballot, which means money on the behalf of organizers against the apartment owners who have $7 million war chest. So what they did is, as a tangent and a side note to this, the council in Richmond voted 7-0 to pull it off the ballot.
Wow.
And the reason, and of course the first reaction was like, wow, we really lost. But this was really the organizers saying, we'd rather pull it off the ballot, write a better ordinance, and have until November of next year to organize to win. But this is what we're up against, right? And real estate is a kind of concrete expression of the commodification of land, and land as a source of profit as opposed to a source of food, homes, communities, and so on. So, even though a lot of the fights end up in this kind of knee-deep in the nuts and bolts of policy and local politics, ultimately this is what we're facing. Because urban land markets now is where global capital is making most of its money, or a lot of its money. So I'll stop there. We can come back to some of these questions later.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to time myself. I talk a lot. So again, my name is Tamika Bennett from East Palo Alto. I just wanted to make sure that was known. And it's hard because it's very different. We are not Palo Alto. Palo Alto is not us. And they will let you know that, so we make sure to let folks know. So East Palo Alto. And I'm on the grassroots organizer side, so we work directly with the families We work, not that Tony doesn't. Tony is working with people too. He works with us a lot too. And I know we probably drive him crazy sometimes because they come in as the planners. We'll be like the dreamers, and we'll be like, oh my God, can we do this and can we do that? And they're like, okay, well, let's be realistic about what we can actually attain. How I wrote all the questions down. If I don't have them correctly, let me know. The first one I think was defining housing justice. And for us, all I hear is my teams in my head like, well, afford you where you live. Yes, that is definitely like 50% of it. At the same time, I think we forget about the personal aspects of housing justice, which is, for us, one huge thing is the feeling of belonging. When you continue to raise prices, and you continue to displace families, there's this feeling of otherness that begins to kind of cloud and settle over everything. And when families don't feel like they belong to the area that they're coming to worship in, that they're coming to work in, that their children go to school in, it starts putting and adding all this undue pressure on an already very heavy load. And so we hear stories, man, like the email Tony got. I mean, that is like on a daily basis. And it's like, unfortunately, if you're not living in East Palo Alto, but some other area in San Mateo County, there's nothing we can do for you because it's totally and completely legal for your landlord to raise the rent or to oust you because they don't like the color of your shirt. I've never heard that, but I mean they really can for any reason. And it's hard to give them counsel, tell them what to do because there isn't much unless they're willing to band together with others who are being treated as they are and start practicing people power, which is what we are all about. We also define it as habitability. So we had a habitability workshop last night in East Palo Alto for some of our renters because there are processes that people don't know are there that they can also use to make the place that they're living in better. But things like this, for us, make up housing justice. You should be able to live in somewhere that is clean, you feel safe, you can afford it, and you feel like you belong there. Housing justice. There are a whole lot of other things, but I got 7 minutes left. We also focus a lot on just the personal stories. So one of our staff members actually, we just had a conversation this morning, and it's hard because when you work in a non-profit organization and you're doing things like fighting for housing, it's funny to hear the stories that are coming even from your peers. And so for her she's now looking for housing again after she just found a place 2 months ago. The person she was sharing the housing with, he was like, I'm done, I'm going back to Michigan because I just can't afford California. So now she's looking for housing again, and she's noticed the effect that it's taken on her daughter. And I think a lot of times we forget the effect that the housing has on children. And her daughter's only about 7 years old. And so they're looking for housing, and she's asking her daughter, are you okay that we have to move again? And her daughter kind of just has this nonchalant attitude, like, it's okay, whatever. And she's like, well, like, what's going on with that? Like, why don't you care? And she's like, well, we've just had to move so much that, I'm not going to worry about it anymore. So now her mom, again, undue added stress and pressure, is like, well, now I'm not able to give my child the childhood she deserves. She can't attach herself to the homes that we get because we have to move so often. What kind of life is that for any 7-year-old? And as a mom, how am I not able to offer that to my kid? And it's just, walking into spaces like this with those stories, it's almost, it's what do we do, right? We are fighting, we are organizing, we are rallying, and it feels like sometimes we are losing battles because of, the realtors, and because of laws that were not designed with people of color in mind. The issues and the tensions that we see that are being raised from this current housing market, definitely jobs and wages, right? I think we are fighting for $15 minimum wage by like 2020, something. Right, and it's like ridiculous and outrageous. By the time we get to 2020,
you 25.
You're gonna need $30, right, to live, right? Schools. we don't think sometimes about what this does to schools. When you have to move out of town, some of our families have gone as far as Stockton, which means their kids can't make it to school every day. Schools are losing funds because kids can't be in school. I'm also falling behind because I can't be in school. We are seeing, again, feelings of otherness. And then we've seen this kind of new phenomenon that's been bubbling under the surface for organizers, which is what are we fighting for? And it's always been to save our community. We're fighting to stave off gentrification. We're fighting to stay in the land that we created. This is our community. And at the same time, when we look at home ownership versus renters, everyone that we serve rents. Everyone rents a home. And that home was bought maybe 2, maybe 3 years ago, which means that it's owned by an investor. Which means that that family that we are fighting for and with will probably have to move in the next year or so. So when we're telling them to attend these meetings and we're asking them to rally with us, there's this new sense of what for? Why? This is not, I'm rallying for what? It's not my community anymore. And I'm going to have to move, and it's probably going to have to be out of this community that I've lived in for like umpteen years. So what am I fighting for? And it's new in the sense that I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a different sense of urgency in the air. There was hope. There was, a sense of we can do this. It can happen. And fast forward to present day, and it's slipping away, and that is a scary feeling, and a scary thought. We do a lot of grant writing. We used to write, in 10 to 15 years, East Palo Alto is going to look drastically different. We've changed that to 3 to 7 years, and 7 is being very generous. 3 to 7 years, East Palo Alto is going to look drastically different from what it did last year, because it's changed even since then. So this narrative and the landscape is constantly changing, and we are desperately trying to find a new one and to find new hope. So that was kind of one of the tensions that has arisen that is very new, at least for us. Then there's also health, and then how can communities and universities work together? My first thought is like research, data, right? That we can be taking to folks who are causing this undue burden, which would be the tech companies. And it's not, I think we're past the blame game, we're past this is your fault. We are really just wanting to come together with solutions and find solutions. So, data is a big piece of that, because sometimes, realtors and board of supervisors and council members, Silicon Valley executives, they don't see people. They see numbers, they see papers, they see a title that says Stanford University. They don't see Cynthia Cruz, who's had to move about 5 or 6 times in the last 4 months. They don't see that piece. Research, data, policy work, the boring parts that we don't want to do, like reading general plan drafts or zoning ordinances, right? And then also the education aspect of that as well. We spent a year educating residents on zoning ordinances and general plan policies and planner jargon, and just so you can go into the room and participate in discussions and conversations. But that stuff goes so fast. There's like a whole new terminology now that I'm like, I did not keep up on, and I do not know. So walking hand in hand in community members like that, I think is really important. And I'm gonna stop there with my timer just stopped.
Well, we'll have time for questions from the back.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. There's a lot of the themes that I try to pick up on that you two spoke of. But my own background is as a cultural anthropologist, actually trained as an educational anthropologist, and it's only when I came upon sort of community-based participatory research as a tool for participating in community development that I made a place-based commitment to community development, CDPR, in a particular area that was dear to me, which is an area in Colorado called Fort Collins, where I was for 6 years before I came out here, and started working with some organizations there, particularly Community Action Board and community advocates around a serious issue there was the idea of gentrification. There was in the city of Fort Collins, which is becoming much more expensive to live, on the north side, there's a number of 3 different neighborhoods that historically have been Hispanic neighborhoods that for generations grew up around what used to be a sugar factory and plantation that was there. And now, for various reasons, the area that's been neglected that they're in is, in most cases with gentrification, it's all of a sudden become this place. Oh, it's kind of near the city. It's near the river. I think this is actually valuable if we can get rid of a lot of these people that are in here and clean up this neighborhood. And so what's been neglected for years now, people are paying attention to. And some people are selling their homes. Some people have businesses growing up around the area that are now not at all in line with the residents that are there. And if I get a chance, I can show some graphics of these 3 neighborhoods, about 600 households that are surrounded by breweries that largely cater to a white middle-class population. Not just because that's the only people that like beer, because clearly that's not the case, but because they don't hire people from the neighborhoods. They're clearly not concerned with seeing the cultural assets of the areas that they're in, and so forth. But in this case, these are a community of households that, and I know Tony mentioned that, this idea that it's a renter issue. It certainly is, but what's amazing is these are homeowners. Most of these are Hispanic homeowners, but experiencing some of these same issues around gentrification. So I want to sort of lay that out a little bit, both the similarities and differences, and I think that this notion of gentrification is often portrayed as a material issue, and you're talking about the commodification of housing, and becomes this notion of, well, it's particularly in the case that I'm working in, that there's a voluntary and involuntary displacement, right? Like if you sell your home, you're basically voluntarily leaving, and that's not something anyone should pay attention to because you got a good price for your house, you moved on. And then there's the notion of involuntary, which is this notion that you get evicted or you get pushed out in some real some sort of real, direct, and enforceable way. But the fact of the matter is, there's a number of people that are selling their homes in these neighborhoods, and they're not selling them because they want to leave. They're selling them because, what Tamika was talking about, there's no more sense of belonging there. What I would call, and what has been called, displacement pressures, acting on people that are microaggressions, that are a feeling that you're no longer a part of that community, both in terms of its vision, in terms of its economic development. You have people knocking on your door every day asking if you're going to sell your house, but they're only knocking on the doors of the Hispanic people, not the newer people that have moved in. So it's clearly a feeling that things are changing, and that you've dealt with it for years. The city seems to be on the side of business. There's no hope, so might as well move. But unfortunately, moving from this neighborhood, which is one of the last affordable neighborhoods in the city, means you leave the city. So we're seeing over the last 15 years a high exodus of Latino working class or fixed income families leaving the city, and with the city saying it doesn't have any real responsibility for it because it's largely voluntary, but clearly doesn't value the historical and cultural heritage of the area, doesn't value the particular issues that are being faced around microaggression. So a lot of the research I was involved in, and maybe if I could just quickly put up the slide, so you'll get a sense of kind of how I, as a researcher, have engaged in this issue with the community, because I think it's just an example of how that can be done.
Slideshow on the top.
I'll quickly pass this. Just to give you, there we go. Just to give you, this is Fort Collins. It's about 150,000 people. It's largely white, and the Hispanic population is dropping, particularly in the city. But it's home to over 20 breweries and distilleries, if you can believe that. I think there's probably 25 by now. This is last summer. That's how quickly that culture is growing. But in the north side neighborhoods, New Belgium is Fat Tires, one that made its distribution out here, you probably recognize. But if you get a sense of these 3 neighborhoods that have historically been Latino, this is where the breweries, this is the north side of the city. But this is where the breweries sit in relationship to them, and they've all opened within the last 15 years. So this isn't the best graphic, but it gives you a sense in those 3 neighborhoods since 1990, how you see the Hispanic population dropping significantly. And this is work that we ended up, as part of the project, we ended up looking at county assessor records and creating, because they said gentrification isn't an issue. Are people really leaving? So we had to go and look through housing, we had to look through deeds and things like that and find out whether or not that was true. And then we luckily had someone on our team that knew how to do GIS stuff, because I had no idea how to do this. But you can see in 1990, just looking at the numbers you see there are the numbers of Hispanic homeowners in these 3 neighborhoods in 1990. As we get to 2000, you see a rather significant drop in just 10 years. The next 10 years, you see another significant drop in the neighborhoods. And then if you look for just the last, from 2010 to 2014, which is just a 4-year period, you see an even more sig. So this is I didn't graph it out. This accelerated process of displacement and exodus of Hispanic families. So in this project, and I'll talk a little bit about how it came to be, but this notion of how we framed it was really important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's looking at gentrification, displacement pressures, issues of cultural heritage and right to the city, and then CBPR is a critical organizing strategy. So I'm going to skip this piece right here, but this started as a partnership. So I, as a researcher, was connected to this community. I'd been a director of the Service Learning Office, so I knew a number of community agencies. And it got to a point that if we're going to try to address these issues, and I can play any part in this, it's going to be in my research capacity. I'm not a community organizer. I'm not a popular educator. I'm not these other things. But I think researchers, when they get together with people who represent these sorts of interests that are absolutely essential to community change, that community organizers are involved, popular educators are involved. We have resident advisory committees together. And the researcher finds a place in that. They have a place in that movement, but that's not something they lead. It's something they participate in. And so we developed this partnership that included a number of people in these different areas. And then we had to, I had this idea that this was going to be a social sustainability issue, but it was clear from the residents and from some of our partners that this wasn't even the right language that we were talking about. We really wanted to understand these issues, what we should do. And this was going to be a sense of kind of interviewing people in the city or working with people in the city and the residents. And the residents and the advocates said, if you even look like you're working with the city, there was such a huge disconnect between the city and these residents that they wouldn't even have participated in this project if they thought the city was involved on any level. So in terms of what we did with this project, we did some visioning sessions with the residents to sort of design what the research was going to look like. We didn't have any real clear idea of what it would be. Doing door-to-door visits, and that came out of the visioning sessions, the fact that we had about 15 people there. We know there are about 350 households. How do we access them? We need to go to them and find out what's going on. We did bi-weekly meetings, and then we did this GIS mapping that came later. But in terms of some of the findings that we got from just this first part, what we call the initial process, was just the level of which residents were experiencing what we're calling displacement pressures around traffic and safety, around the kinds of negative incidents they're having with new, more affluent residents coming in, issues with the breweries, civic disengagement, and so forth. So I'm just going to give a couple quick examples. This is a resident talking about the issues with the breweries and what's happened. And I'm going to give you a chance to sort of read through it. So when we talk about a sense of belonging or a sense of a neighborhood that for 3 generations, it's gone through tough times. They've had crime, they've had other issues along the way that they fought, but it was their home. And now this is the kind of things that they're experiencing. At the same time, the city is paying more attention. There's been some investments in infrastructure and so forth. But clearly, microaggressions you see here, you see racist activity. So again, these are people that have lived there for a long time. They're starting to feel like the cities, they don't belong in the city, they don't belong in this neighborhood anymore. Maybe they should leave. Of course, perceptions that the city doesn't care, that all of a sudden now they seem to be more interested in the neighborhood because the new people are coming in, and that maybe better changes will come, but they're not going to benefit the people that are there. So this is not about a material relationship. These homeowners, the land prices are going to go up a little bit, their taxes are going to get a little bit higher, but the real issue is around whether or not, what are these social issues? Was his home anymore? And the attachment they've had for so long. And again, if they leave and they sell, they're in some outlying area that's less resourced, further from where they work and live, and where they work and exist. And then you see this connection between civic engagement here and just, when this building, it's talking about some new things going up, I'm going to put up my house for sale, I'm out of here. So again, these are the kinds of things that are pushing them up that are not necessarily financial. I'm going to skip this just for no waste of time, but a lot of different ways. And this is where, I'm going to leave with one quote here, which I think gets you a sense of the deep emotional experience that people who are feeling displaced are having, right? And this is talking about meetings and whether or not their voices are being heard. So again, I put these out to emphasize the fact that when we think about displacement and gentrification, affordability is a key, and particularly in the Bay Area, is a key issue. But all the other things that Tony had talked about when he talked about neighborhood stability and about health and quality and about community control, those issues are just as apparent in this situation as they are in the same kinds of things happening around the Bay Area. So. We ended up making a list of policy applications and presenting it to the city, who was not happy at all by what we were saying, but they were moved to act because of the amount of pressure that was on them and because they didn't want to look bad. So just quickly, the last thing I will say is there was a number of neighborhood improvement projects that were not budgeted at all until after the study came out. Interestingly, this is the area, these are the 3 neighborhoods, and I don't know if you can read this, but in terms of where they invested money, they put money into things like new sidewalks, into things like dealing with the traffic, the kinds of improvements that residents actually saw as value. And it came partly out of this research process that put pressure on the city to come up with money and address these issues, which they started to do immediately. So, and again, there was some positive benefit to the research so far, but lots of challenges that we can talk about as we talk about the tensions and way to move forward around community control. How do you keep people motivated and fighting a system that really, in its essence, is not concerned with their plight? It's more concerned with the commodification of land, and it goes to the highest bidder and so forth. But this was the start of something. But I wanted to give a quick example of what a research partnership can look like, and that was one of them. So I'll stop.
Okay, I want to add one thing, and it might be super obvious, but I believe some people don't know this or don't recall it as forcefully. And I want to reinsert justice at the center of this discussion, because Tamika made a really important point when we talk about home ownership. For the vast proportion of people that call themselves homeowners, that's a misnomer. The banks own your house. And what's really important to add on to that piece is that all of you who have home loans know you get a tax write-off. So when you talk about public subsidized housing, those subsidies are what allow a lot of us homeowners to own a home. You guys we're getting a tax write-off on it, but the public bears the burden of that. And this is the same pattern that we saw with the collapse of the real estate speculation insurance and all that in 2008, which was that when you have private speculation that succeeds, those profits go to the private investors. When the speculation fails, it becomes a public debt, right, in the form of bailouts. And the kicker is that then we get austerity programs globally, and what gets back to Tamika's point about feeling alienated and not belonging, and furthermore undeserving, is when we're told, well, you're spending too much. These bailouts for the public are not legit. You should learn to live with less. And so more and more, those funds are strained for going to the people for actually entitlements, not really benefits. But the rich get it anyway. And so I think it's important to understand that these systems that we consider to be neutral, and Tamika and Tony also touched on this idea of education. We think of public education. Well, if you're hungry, you're not going to be able to, that's not a neutral system. Or when you have to take long commutes into getting to your school, or when your teachers are underpaid and burnt out. So the illusion that this is free public system that Americans equally benefit from, that's a vast illusion. And then when people aren't able to, quote unquote, succeed at the rate, pass all the standardized tests, then it's their failure. So I think that this is something that we really need to understand, not just in terms of legal notions of justice, but more moral issues of justice. How some populations are considered to be immoral, amoral, when in actuality you know, the system itself is what's screwed up. So I thought just, you know, insert that in to the equation. When I was offered a job in Toronto, you know, we were house shopping. So, well, of course, with the tax write-off, when they looked at me like, what the hell are you talking about? You know, we're the only country in the world that has this built-in inequity. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. But let's just open it up now for further. Any of the speakers want to elaborate or any questions you have?
Who can explain, who these realtors and investors are? Because I think that's what's missing for me. I feel like I see them in my mind as these evil, horrific monsters. And I want to know who they are. I want to know, is there dialogue going on? Like, people saying, look at what you're doing to these people, to communities, I mean, who are they that they can act this way?
They're Americans.
I was going to say, I have to admit, like, in the working for, I know a lot of the people that do real estate, honestly. Like, they're people that I know. And because of the commodification issue, they say, this is just the way housing works. Like, yeah, people have to leave. Cities are changing all the time. People are moving all the time, right? It becomes this larger argument that is within the logic of the way capital works in the housing. They're not thinking about moral frameworks. That's not part of it. It's just like, it's unfortunate, but those people will find homes elsewhere. They'll get by. But this is the way it works. And I think it's really within a really normative paradigm of what property is and how people access it and how they use it and when they lose it and when they have to go somewhere else.
Even realtors have to pay a mortgage.
Yeah.
And I think, and take this with a grain of salt, some of them are just plain evil. They are these monsters sitting behind a desk somewhere that just plain don't care. In East Palo Alto, our entire affordable housing portfolio is owned by one person. His name is Sam Zell, and he's not a good man. He does not believe in affordable housing. He literally, in an interview, he said, if you can't afford to own a home, you don't deserve one.
Yeah.
This is who owns a good fourth of my community. Owns, not like, he owns it, it's his. So I mean, I think a lot of them just aren't good people. And when you have community who are doing their darndest to band together and to fight and to draft ordinances and protection policies, and you're getting slammed without even being offered, an opportunity to speak at like council meetings and board meetings. I mean, there are people pulling strings behind the curtains. And a lot of those people are realtors, yes. They own the lands there. I mean, just in my experience, they haven't been good people.
Just quickly, I mean, I think the kind of keystone here is the issue of property values. And however good you are, this gets a bit to what Clay was saying, however good you are, however bad you are, the thing here is what happens with this policy, what happens with these people relative to property values. If you look at the real estate industry going back to the 1930s, it's consistently all over the country in small associations, big associations, as individual realtors that defended policies that lift property values and fought policies that hurt property values. And that's completely implicated with other kinds of inequalities, specifically around race. Right? I mean, there's a strong connection between perceptions of property value and the color of the people who live there. So it's not an objective measure, a kind of economistic measure. It's actually a social measure. So on the one hand, it doesn't really matter whether they're good or not, or whether they're evil or not. They're responding to a dynamic. And in this country, for a lot of people, both investors who invest in property, whether they're a mom and pop outfit or whether they're a global equity firm, their profit or their investment is based on property values. And so even if they're good people, they don't have the luxury, in a sense, to say, okay, I'm going to let my investment tank. So a lot of what we see at some of these meetings, the realtors are I mean, I don't think it's a brilliant strategy, but it's pretty obvious, is that they put the most vulnerable property owners out front to talk about how bad rent control is, right? So they get the immigrant landlords who worked 3 jobs for 20 years, bought some property, and are using the income from that to send their kids to college to have a better life. And it's just like, oh my God, rent control is evil, right?
Right.
One, that's not the majority of landlords by any means.
Right.
2, A lot of them are not as hard luck as they make it sound when they get up in front of council and talk. And three, the ones that are in a sense victims too. I mean, they have been able to essentially carve out some kind of existence based on the privatization of property. My position is for that particular case that we can't make policy around housing as a human right based on this, right? That is not a policy going forward that's going to produce any kind of equity, much less justice. So it's not that every property owner, certainly every landlord is a bad person. We've met lots of good landlords who have kept market rents below market rate, but they are a minority, right? And you can't base policy on them.
Yes, please.
Can I ask, and I don't know very much about whether or not these claims that I want to ask about are grounded in fact. I've heard a lot about foreign buyers, especially wealthy people from mainland China, from India, buying up property in San Francisco. Like, is there a basis for these sorts of claims, and sort of what impact does that have on the way that people are talking about these issues?
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, one of the things that we're experiencing here is part of a global phenomenon, which there is now a global real estate market, right? Goldman Sachs is buying up farmland in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Private investors from the Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, from the United Emirates, from Russia, from China, from India, as they're gaining wealth, are parking it in real estate. And a lot of the most secure real estate is in places where property is protected more than anything. And that's places like the United Kingdom and the United States, right? So it's a safe place to park money. So yes, on the West Coast, because we're a part of the PAC Rim region, a lot of the money's coming in from Asia, right? In London, which is going through the same thing, it's mostly money from Russia and Saudi Arabia, right? So there is a global real estate market. There's tons of money to be made if you have money to park, and it's a safe investment if you have a lot of wealth, right? So I see buildings, including my own, where people are buying up units from abroad and putting their kids in it. I mean, adult kids, right? So they buy a unit in San Mateo, their kid goes to school here, gets a job here, and they buy the unit as an investment, and then also becomes a place for their kids or their relatives to live, right? So that is a concern. My concern with that is that we have to identify it and assess it as a dynamic. But my concern is that, especially here, it becomes part of a kind of anti-Chinese xenophobic wave, which is much bigger than property.
Right.
But so I've been in community meetings with people who I want to work with who are like, it's these Chinese. And I'm like, wait a minute, let's disaggregate global capitalism and property markets from how newly wealthy people in China or India or Russia are dealing with their wealth, right? So, I mean, yes, what you're saying is certainly a big part of the dynamic here, from big institutional investors to newly wealthy middle-class Chinese or Indians who are looking for a safe place to park the money they've made because their economy's done well, and a certain segment of that population now has disposable income and investment capital.
Yeah, and it's important to note it's been happening since the late 1970s.
Yeah,
I mean, and the whole English-only Act came out of Monterey Park in LA, right? So it's been building up ever since these fluctuations in global capital. But yeah.
So what are we going to do? I mean, it's like it's so huge. I live in San Francisco, and I just think it's interesting that we're talking about low-income people, but I mean, that bar of low income is huge now. I mean, the only reason I can live in San Francisco is that I have rent control, and I live in fear. And so I just like it's, and there was the moratorium on mission housing, and that failed. So I just feel we're talking about capitalism. Right? I mean, Jeremy Sarabel was here a couple of years ago talking about the fact that everything is commodified in the U.S. So I'm just like, what strategies? Just even as a person who's not even having to move every few months, is like, I feel in some ways hopeless. I don't know what you're like. I don't see how we're going to take real estate off the market in the U.S. I guess is what I'm wondering about.
I think that's a very big question. I don't think there is any one answer. I think there are many, and I think that we have to be creative about them. The creation of more affordable housing isn't the end-all be-all. It is definitely one pathway. There's also policies, yes, rent control, just cause for evictions, and my mind's failing me, but I mean, all of them. I think there are a number of answers, but I mean, the biggest one for me is people. I think we are the answer, and not just us on the ground organizing. I think it's, yeah, the realtors and those in power meeting us halfway. I mean, something has to give. Things cannot continue as they are, or everything's gonna crash. Something.
Which seems like what we're waiting for. That's
I mean,
so
I
weird,
feel
right?
like we're waiting for like the .com bust again, but this time with housing, and everything just goes belly up. Because I mean, if we continue this way, who in their right mind is going to be able to afford to live anywhere in Silicon Valley?
Right.
Anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think as you know, this idea of the retro nation, I mean, numerically, we're getting the numbers. The problem is consciousness. And when you talk about investors and, you know, they have rationalized their own, you know, horribleness in all sorts of ways, you know. And what we have to do is break through that, but also see our connectivity, right? That in other words, we can't say, well, it's bad for them, but it's okay for me. I'm close to the you know, the manageable scale. And so that fragments us. But I think that it's precisely the work that you all do to raise consciousness. It's the fundamental issue here. Is to see common cause, not breaking up different micro communities to say, well, one is better than the other, so we don't have anything in common.
One thing I want to add to that too is, you know, talking with some people in, you know, with urban planners and talking with government, and they say things like, we're committed to equitable development on some level, but we don't want to be in the housing business. Government doesn't want to be in the housing business, right? So what they do is they dismiss that. They say, we're committed to this in principle, but, you know, there's little things we can do around the edge, but we're not going to start buying up money. We're not going to, you know, that's not what we do. And so that's a problem right there. And you wonder if equitable development in theory is going to be met in practice with this, you know, some really basic notions about maintaining economically and socially diverse communities that are stable over the long term, for example. That sounds like a great idea, I think, for everybody. I think democracy can get into that, but it requires some significant shifts to the way the capital works and government's role in that, or, you know, some public entities' role in that.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to do away with Fannie Mae and Sallie Mae. I mean, precisely to privatize all this stuff, which is going to make it a million times worse.
So this is bringing a bunch of stuff that I'm thinking about together. So I'm working with the new Blum Center at UC Santa Cruz, and we should talk because I'm in the Department of Anthropology. But we are thinking about how these series of critical issues are kind of linked together with regard to food, fiscal, and housing security. And when you pick one up, you necessarily pick them all up. And in Santa Cruz, we are looking at one of the main, like one of the biggest landlords and employers, the University of California, which is insistent on this growth model. And so part of the organizing happening on our UC Santa Cruz campus is around creating and presenting an alternative growth model, because in Santa Cruz we also have one of the highest rates of homelessness in the nation. So, and students are very much part of that, but it also goes beyond the student body. So thinking about, I'm curious about what you all are, how you're thinking about growth and these corporate growth models, because I really consider University of California to fit into that, and just like, how does this tie in with interrupting these growth models where it is profit-based, and how do we like kind of come back around to other priorities, or sort of like disrupt that discourse that's happening around growth? I mean, it like, kind of seems impossible, but
do you mean growth in terms of like measures of economic growth? Or?
Yeah, because that's what, I mean, the UC system-wide, but especially in Santa Cruz, wants to grow, like increase the student body population, but we can't look after the student body population that already exists with regard to housing and funding. And then that also doesn't take into consideration the institution and community relations, which are horrendous, and especially around the issue of housing. So you have these big institutions that are coming in that are actually really causing a lot of damage.
The UC system is strange because you know there are crown jewels and there are Santa Cruz, right? But if you look at the Board of Regents, you know, Bloom, I mean, these all real estate guys. I mean, they're the evil cabal.
I guess, let me ask a more specific question. So I have a year-long appointment working in the Blum Center. How can I make the most of my position in the lion's den a little bit? And how can I walk away in the spring and say, oh yeah, by the way, I think we should do this, and this is going to look big.
What do I tell them?
And, you know, I'm in the UC too, and part of it for me is divestment and the investment portfolio at the highest level. And, you know, Blum particularly with this, and this is not to pick on that particular corner of an institution. There's plenty of examples here, I'm sure. We find ourselves in this contradiction where on one hand, you know, our students are aligning with organizations like yours and Just Cause and helping to produce these vital community reports, and the institutions themselves are invested in the processes that are driving these crises. So, you know, and our student bodies are really powerfully waking up to those tensions, I think. But how do we take it, you know, to the next level of being institutions that have accountability to, you know, communities, state, and conceptions of justice in moral, political ways? That's a big conundrum.
Just to add to this, I mean, I think divestment is an important thing to think about, but then also reinvestment. So, you know, so what can a university do in a positive role?
Yeah.
You know, and thinking about, yeah, we want to divest from fossil fuels, we want to divest from, you know, a lot of different evil interests, but are there ways and are there models that are happening at universities? If we think about a university as an anchor institution in a community, that we can look other places where, you know, and there are universities that have done a lot to underwrite loans for homeowners, and, you know, can we see that in affordable housing development too? That the university can be someone that has a lot of resources that can, you know, put money in the bank to help this kind of development that can happen in a different way that can be more sustainable. Other than affordable housing development, I'm not sure what it looks like for the rest of the pillars, you know, and other things like rent control and tenants' rights and things like that. But, you know, maybe those financial resources can be, not only we can stop investing, but reinvest them in another way.
I mean, I think coming back to the growth model that you talked about, I mean, the same things happen in urban areas, right? I mean, in the area that I work in, there's always this notion that giving tax breaks to new HP coming in or new people coming in, even though, you know, knowing that they're coming in is going to create higher income, it's going to create more need for housing, and so they said, we'll just make more dense housing, and now there's resistance against more dense housing in the area. And then if you start putting a moratorium on building, you end up like, instead of $350,000 homes, which are currently in Fort Collins, you're going to have Boulder, which is what Boulder did. They put a moratorium on building, now they're $800,000 average per home. So again, that growth issue is, you know, I don't know how you manage that, but that's the same thing that's happening elsewhere. It's not just a university issue, it's a broad issue. Because that's a dominant way of thinking about urban development, is keep bringing in money that increases taxes and increases the status of the city, and everything will go up. But in fact, it's just the opposite for people who are lower middle income or fixed income.
So what about these collaborations then? Because we have grassroots organizing in the community and on campus, like at the student level, and our sort of stage that we're at right now is like gathering narratives and sharing narratives and just having a public space for that level of just like building that up. But then we have like somewhat sneaky use of institutional resources to do research around these issues that the institutions are actually exacerbating, and so to bring that around and sort of have the more official empirical sort of backing up that you can take to the policymakers and things like that. But like, how do you form those collaborations? I mean, in a university, perhaps you can do that, but what about outside of that context? Or, you know?
Well, one of the things that I'm working on, I think it's in line with what you're asking, is looking for constituencies that are outside of the traditional housing world. And the two ones that I'm working with that are somewhat overlapping, one is labor unions. So in San Mateo County, for example, where I'm doing this the most, you know, trying to get unions, regardless of the sector that they represent, but to say, look, you all know that housing is an issue for your members, right? You all know that you're losing your member base because they're leaving the area because they can't afford to be here, and yet there's not really much action on behalf by unions on behalf of like renters' rights. So to me, that seems like a huge problem. And labor is in crisis as a political force, and partly it's because it's become somewhat sequestered from everything else and attached to the Democratic Party, all of that we know. But locally, so, I talk with people that I know who are in the union sector and say, what would it look like for us to build a broader social justice platform? Like, we support your wage campaigns, you support our housing campaigns, and we don't see those as two different campaigns that just marry out of convenience, but in fact, the people being affected are the people making $12 an hour and can't pay rent, right? And instead of pulling them in two different directions, either work with the union or work with housing activists, say, this is actually one fight. Related to that is the teachers. This gets to the issue that it's not just low-income people. I met with the superintendent of the San Mateo Foster City School District last week, and she said we have dozens of classified staff, not teachers, but classified staff positions empty that we can't fill. And we do have teacher slots empty. We offer people jobs from other parts of the country coming out of teaching school, and they look at the salary, they look at housing, and they're like, sorry, I can't do it. So there are schools in the district, in all districts, where they just can't fill the slots. City workers, I work in cities where the city's losing staff because they can't afford to stay. So part of the right to the city's argument is that we know what the core issues are. When we identified housing and then renters as a core organizing issue, we knew what we were talking about. And now we're trying to bring other constituencies that are working on other issues on board, and it's happening. You look at Silicon Valley Rising, right, which is anchored by working partnerships. This is traditionally a labor-oriented organization, research and policy, but they're anchoring a lot of the housing and renters work in Santa Clara County. Right, San Jose is going through a redoing of its rent control ordinance because it's lame, and adding just cause and working partnerships and packages of PICO-based affiliate, faith-based progressives, and others debug, like they're coming together. They're not only working on housing and rents, they're working on other stuff too, like the wages and so on, and immigration and police brutality, But the trick, and this gets a little bit to the question of what do we do, is that we know there are so many constituencies out there that are oppressed by this system. And actually, there are a lot of the same people, but we divide them into constituencies. And partly that's our own fault. The U.S. left and the U.S. progressives have a particular history that's different from other places. So you look at Spain, where they've made much more progress in mobilizing people across sectors and taking power, like of city governments. Madrid, Barcelona have fallen to kind of progressive forces. We saw it in Greece at the national level, but then the European Union kind of cracked the whip, and the Greeks blinked. And Syriza kind of has fallen apart, but are remobilized. I mean, I don't want to get to the global piece, but partly it's because they've mobilized students, intellectuals, workers, homeowners who have been hit by the mortgage crisis, which was a global crisis, and said, don't let ourselves be divided into these kind of identities that pull us politically at heart. It's very hard here because those identities are so powerful. The identity of whiteness, the identity of homeowner, the identity of, even with labor, again, I mean, I like labor, but I think politically there's sometimes a real challenge.
Sure, yeah.
But their workers are hurting. And especially now with the kind of informalization of the economy, all of that.
Right.
So for us, the trick is how do we now take this reality and weave it into something which is a more potent political force than the ones we're up against, right? And I see, not to get too kind of far afield into the broader question of how do you do this work when you lose so much. But in any given struggle that we point to, especially civil rights that won unbelievable gains, there were times when it seemed like they could never win. I mean, how do you be a civil rights activist in 1930 in Mississippi and think you're going to win, right? What kept them motivated in those conditions? And if they could stay motivated for decades, then certainly we can, right? And another way of saying that is like if you build in a just world, then you work for it whether or not you're going to win tomorrow or not. And what is the alternative? Right.
I wanted to, maybe sort of continue the coalition piece is what I'm really interested in. And I don't know if others had thoughts on that too. I mean, I'm thinking, so in Oakland recently there's a big debate on development on East 12th Street. People may have heard about this development. It's a public land. It's being potentially sold off. But the city council was about to vote on it, and activists shut down the city council meeting, and a lot of them were Black Lives Matter was part of the message too, making the connection between when gentrification is happening in our communities, that also brings more police, and who gets arrested, and who are the people bearing the brunt of that increased police force, as people call it. So I don't know, I mean, Tamika, or in the work of Fort Collins, I mean, I'd like to hear if either of you have, thoughts on other constituents that you have done work to stitch together. I know that the work at UCA isn't just about housing, right? It's about climate, it's about education, and trying to put those pieces together and what that looks like, and how we can continue to push that coalition moving forward.
I think right now it looks really messy because for us it's kind of trying to weave together all these different pieces and move together with one agenda. I think that's the hardest piece. And I attended one of the coalition meetings that Tony was just talking about, that we were spearheading with labor and housing, and I was just like sitting there really kind of blown away that they can come together and say, so we're going to be your mouthpiece in our meetings and you're going to be ours and yours. And so we've been working with like San Mateo County Health Department, and that's just been different. We weren't even aware that they could be out. So I think that a part of it is really even just throwing feelers out there and seeing what bites. Who bites?
Sometimes it's one.
Sometimes it is just one, and that's fine. Start with that one. And I mean, balls are gonna drop. They did, and like Tony was saying, you keep going. Like we kept going when I mean, we got some of our funding was being threatened to be taken away because we were working with like a public institution, and we kept going. So I mean, I think it's for us, and I can't speak for anyone else. It's really new, quilting together all these different things. I mean, climate change and affordable housing, we are still fighting with people about that one because it's like, first of all, I mean, I think people are past the fact that climate change is real and it's actually happening. And so now to add affordable housing into that mix, they're like, what are you talking about? And so it's just, for us, we're trying to find those narratives. But as long as people keep coming back to the table, which is what they've been doing, I think we're okay for now. And we're just kind of stumbling around and figuring it out together. But, yeah.
I think, for example, in Fort Collins, there's other people, and I think Tony used the idea of people who are also being oppressed by the situation. There's the artist community that's there, the renter population, that students are there, and there's a chance for really doing coalitions with them to push the issue of affordability, quality of life, and so forth. But there's been a lot of resistance among the partners that I work with, because those other groups are largely, they're colorblind. They're the kinds of issues that are being brought to the table that are experienced in these neighborhoods. There's this fear that when the students and the artists come in, the issues that are really sort of important to, that are race-based, that are deeper issues, are going to somehow get covered up, and this whole thing's going to go forward. And the artist community has a lot of money and a lot of backers in the philanthropic community. And so they're not sure if that partnership's actually going to be beneficial. I think it has to happen at some point, but there has to be conversations before then about how these issues are the same, but also how they're different in each case, and what sort of the real textured nuances of the different kinds of oppression that people are facing. You can't just throw them all in one bucket and say, this is how we solve the problem, or some people are going to get forgotten, left behind, or not taken seriously. So the coalition building has started. I think there's some community health groups that are really interested in this, seem to be a little bit more understanding of some of these issues around social, cultural, racial difference. But there's other organizations that need to be educated. So I think some dialogues need to happen before a coalition is built in a way that I think that coalition is going to equally serve all the people that are within.
Just the last one. I don't know if it's the last one. I just said that. Anyway, it seems like what you guys are talking about too is that pressure has to be put on local governments, right? Does that seem like with the strategies seems like one of the? Because obviously, like shifting the capitalistic paradigm is problematic, but it seems like putting pressure on local government seems the best strategy at this point.
I mean, I see two aspects to that. One is that there are certain things you want to win that is within the purview what local government does, like an ordinance. So that's the natural target. We're not doing it because it's part of the, or it's not because it's directly linked to a larger kind of paradigm shift. It's like we want rent control. Rent control is what local government does not, state doesn't give it to city rent control. But there's also the question of like, and this is the political mobilization question, you have to go to where people are at. In other words, if this thing that people are being hit by right now is evictions and rents, then that's what you go and organize around. And you use those as opportunities to talk about these bigger things. And you use the fight at local city government so people learn what it means to fight and what the barriers are, right? So there's the mobilization question, and there's the question of there are actually certain concrete things you want to win, that makes sense as the target.
And I would just add that sometimes local government, they have the biggest stake in it. Like for us in East Palo Alto, East Palo Alto, like the folks who founded our city, it took 20 years for incorporation, and they fought tooth and nail just to get incorporation. Once we got that, they were very, very implicit in making sure that we had things like just cause for eviction and rent control and rent stability. I mean, so they have, they are the biggest stakeholders in these things. So I mean, a lot of the time most of the time, they are working with us in some of these things, but you have outside forces who can come in with the big money to defeat stuff on measures, which they don't though because of people power. So they put in like $300-something thousand, and we had about maybe 1,500, and we still were able to pass rent control. So I mean, it's just, I think for us, local government has like the biggest stake in this, and so sometimes they're happy when we're at those meetings and are asking me to do things because we'll do the legwork. We just need you to pass it. So I mean, I think it depends on the other too.
Yeah.
One more question?
Oh, sure. Last question. Okay.
No pressure.
Okay, so as a first-year grad student here, I don't know too much about Stanford's involvement in Palo Alto, in East Palo Alto. Is Stanford involved in working toward housing justice, or is it one of these real estate players that is creating problems? So just as some context, I went to undergraduate at University of Southern California. There are some very strong tensions there between the university and South Central, and I'm just curious what the situation looks like.
Just wondering.
Awesome. Right well, in terms of just the university in the city, I think tensions are getting better. I think they've been in the past pretty strained. But you have like newer comers like myself who are wanting to, first I don't even understand why the relationships are so strained for some of my elders. Besides the calls we get from Stanford students asking to do papers like right then and there, we're trying to find new ways, and so like working with Daniel and David on like the classes, and then this new, which I'm pretty sure you guys are going to pick this up, the Housing Justice Coalition, where we are being very intentional about the relationship between the community and the university. Knowing each other's strengths and making sure that no one particular partner is being run over, but really trying to walk hand in hand in like finding solutions for affordable housing. And I'll let you just pick up the ball there.
Yeah, join Just Communities.
There you go. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, Just Communities Initiative. I think I said that wrong.
Do you want to say more?
I'll say, and certainly we're all members here, so I don't need to, but we have spent some time getting together, some people on campus really talking about the ways in which the university resources can be mobilized to address in a positive way these community issues. And what's great about this group is we're thinking about sort of guiding principles for that, like who leads this? It needs to be responsive to communities. It needs to come from the campaigns of current people, of the organizations that are doing this work. And then, starting to ask what are those, what are those, we call them buckets of needs that are needed. How can we identify those and then create a space or an interface where we can take, scholars who may be interested, faculty, students, others, that can then sort of be plugged into the work that needs to be done on the community level in order to really, I think most universities have a plan to go in and research something. We're trying to turn that around and say, what are the needs, and let's be responsive to them, which is somewhat non-normative, but I think if we're going to work together, and so this is what this group is trying to figure out. How do we do that? How do we get resources for that? How do we create this interface where people can communicate, because Stanford's so decentralized that, I think it was Daniel Saber the other day. He said, we work with a lot of people on Stanford. This person over here, this person over here, this person over here, and we're kind of, taking them for a particular issue. What if we were together talking about these issues and being real strategic about what needs are and what short-term and long-term partnerships might look like? So that's the idea of this initiative, is to start to sort of plan that out and see what it looks like and bring people on board.
So if you're interested,
I am.
so the group is called the Just Communities Initiative. We started in the spring out of another event talking about housing. That's some folks here were on that panel as well. And we meet first Wednesday of the month at 11 o'clock in the CSRE conference room. It's in building 360. Room 361J. We'd love to have some new folks. We're really, a lot of it, as Clayton was saying, we're trying to figure out principles and trying to get priorities straight, but we'd love to have a lot of other folks in on that conversation as well. If you're interested in doing research or classes or just being involved in learning more, we'd love to have folks join the conversation with us.
And you sort of Bay Area wide? Are you looking primarily like?
So the community partners that are involved are sort of East Palo Alto, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and have been a little more local. We haven't been working with folks in the East Bay and San Francisco at this point, but I think that's definitely been part of the conversation. How do we make this relevant and draw some of the connections between what's happening in the Bay Area? There are different regulations and different ordinances and codes, and so things get complicated in translating some of these needs in the work. But I think definitely, want to be part of this larger conversation.
I think we'll hang around for a bit so people can interact with us, but maybe we can now thank everybody for coming out and giving such great talks, and if you can
This is a conference that continues tomorrow. We have a whole new set of panels, so do check out the schedule. If you don't have one handy on your mobile device, then we do have printouts over there, so we hope that you'll return tomorrow and be part of the ongoing conversations.
Yeah.